Political standoff in Israel. The second election in 5 months fails to produce a winner. Unconfirmed results show the parties of Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz won the same number of seats. The US top diplomat Mike Pompeo travels to Saudi Arabia as Washington and Riyadh insist Iran was behind Sunday's attack on Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure. Tehran denies any involvement. And the European Parliament votes in favour of granting another Brexit delay. In a non-binding vote, MEPs say they're in favour of extending Article 50 if the British government makes such a request. Those are the headlines this hour. You're watching France 24. First, it's deadlock in Israel following the second election in 5 months. Neither the party of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu nor that of his rival Benny Gantz has managed to win a majority. Latest results, unconfirmed results, show them tied. Right-wing leader Avigdor Lieberman looks to be in the position of kingmaker once again, while a joint list of Arab parties have come third, thanks to higher turnout among Arab Israeli voters. For the very latest, let's go to Jerusalem. France 24's Iris Makler is there. So, Iris, an inconclusive result. We'll have some tough negotiations ahead. Tell us who will sit with who when it comes to forming that coalition.
The question is who won't sit with who, actually, because at the moment the numbers won't allow a coalition if everyone sticks to what they originally said. For example, the Blue and White Party could sit with the Likud, headed by Netanyahu. They would have the majority like that. But they have said all along that they won't sit with Benjamin Netanyahu or a prime minister who's under threat of being charged with corruption. Can they change that? The Likud has said that it's sticking with Benjamin Netanyahu, but Blue and White would happily sit with them if they aren't headed by Netanyahu. Could they change that? Avigdor Lieberman, the kingmaker, he has said he will not sit in Netanyahu's government while it's headed by these ultra-Orthodox leaders. That's what brought him his doubled seats. That's what he campaigned on. It was very successful for him. Could he change that? So those are the questions. These people will have to come to a negotiation changing something that they have gone to the public with and persuaded them to vote for them on that basis.
And Iris, what reaction has there been to the fact that Arab parties are now the third biggest force in Israeli politics?
Well, as you can imagine, Arab politicians and analysts are elated and very proud of themselves. The last time voter turnout was very low. It was something like 49%. Now it's around 60%. Not all the votes have been counted. So they're very pleased with that result. They say it's partly because they are reunified. It's a joint list of Arab parties, and that's what the public wanted. It's also, they say, a result of the nasty campaign that Benjamin Netanyahu ran against the Arab parties and against Israel's Arab citizens, even repeating something that he'd apologised for in a previous election by calling on his voters to come to the polls because Arabs are being bussed, Arabs are voting in large numbers. So it's quite interesting that even a crony, Likud party officials and a crony of Netanyahu's concede that perhaps they went too far, and as one of them put it, this blew up in their face.
All right, Iris, thanks very much indeed. Iris Makler there in Jerusalem. Now, the US President Donald Trump has named a new national security advisor. Robert O'Brien replaces John Bolton as the fourth official to fill the role since Trump took office. He was the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs at the State Department previously. And Trump has today ordered his Treasury Secretary to substantially increase sanctions on Iran. That's following Sunday's attack on Saudi Arabia. Washington and Riyadh both blame Iran for bombing crucial oil infrastructure. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will be visiting the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman later today. Tehran, for its part, continues to deny any involvement in the attack. Fraser Jackson has the latest.
The blame game continues as the US points the finger towards Iran for Saturday's attack on Saudi oil facilities. Tehran is standing firm. They say Yemeni Houthi rebels carried out the attack and blames the US-backed military coalition for forcing the Houthis into firing what they called a warning shot.
The Yemeni people showed a reaction. They hit a location. They did not hit hospitals, so why are you upset? They did not hit schools. They did not hit the Sana'a Bazaar. They attacked an industrial site to warn you.
The international community is watching the situation closely. French President Emmanuel Macron approved a request by Saudi authorities to send experts to Riyadh to investigate the attacks. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is also expected to hold discussions with the Saudis on possible retaliation. It was hoped that bilateral talks between the US and Iran could be held on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly next week. Iran ruled this out unless the US came back to a multilateral nuclear deal which Trump abandoned last year.
Without this happening, no negotiation will take place at any level between the authorities of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Americans, neither in New York nor anywhere else.
Iran's representatives might not even make the summit at all. Iranian media reported on Wednesday that the US was yet to issue them visas to travel to New York. Saudi Arabia has been investigating the source of Saturday's attacks. Its findings are expected to be published shortly.
Here in France, a group of 16 NGOs are accusing the government of complicity in war crimes after footage emerged purporting to show French warships enforcing a devastating blockade on Yemen. Prior to the Saudi-led blockade, 90% of Yemen's food was imported. The UN says 10 million Yemenis are now at risk of starvation. The latest revelations come from Disclose, Radio France, Mediapart and Arte.
A warship made in France, actively participating in the Saudi-led blockade of Yemen. A team of investigative reporters compiled footage from various news reports since the start of the war. They've spotted 3 French-made vessels and 1 helicopter operating in the waters surrounding the war-torn country. Maintenance of at least one of these ships is also reportedly carried out by French companies. Saudi Arabia and the UAE purchased these vessels from France. Both countries are now key players in the war in Yemen. In 2015, the Saudi-led coalition launched a land, sea and air blockade on the country. Their main goal was to stop weapons falling into the hands of Houthi rebels. But this September, the UN's panel of experts on Yemen said it fears starvation is being used as a method of warfare. Due to the blockade, now over 1 in 3 Yemenis is one step away from famine. The international body has called for a ban on weapons sales to those involved in Yemen's war, pointing the finger directly at the UK, the US and France, and warning they could be complicit in war crimes.
The parties to the conflict in Yemen are responsible for an array of human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law. Some of these violations are likely to amount to war crimes.
In April, NGO Disclose revealed classified documents on French weapons used in Yemen. A few weeks later, France's domestic intelligence agency summoned the reporters, a move slammed by rights activists as an attack on press freedom. As for these latest revelations, the Prime Minister's office responded to the journalists, insisting that France's international commitments are respected when it comes to the transfer of weapons.
At least 26 children and 2 teachers have perished in a fire at an Islamic school in the Liberian capital, Monrovia. President George Weah has been visiting the site in Painesville, which is on the outskirts of the capital. Police say the cause of the fire, which broke out overnight, is not known. It is common for buildings in Liberia's big cities to collapse because of faulty electrics. It is rare, though, that those fires are deadly. The European Parliament has voted in favour of granting another extension to Brexit. The non-binding vote supports extending Article 50 beyond the end of next month if the British government requests a delay. But it must be justified with a specific purpose, such as a new general election or a second referendum. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said he will not seek another extension, even though Parliament has passed a law which obliges him to do so. Both the EU's chief negotiator Michel Barnier and the outgoing EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker have warned that a no-deal exit is still a very real possibility.
I advise everyone not to underestimate the consequences of the absence of a deal, clearly for the United Kingdom first of all, but also for us. Almost 3 years after the UK referendum, we should not be pretending to negotiate.
The risk of a no-deal Brexit remains very real. I called on the British Prime Minister to come forward in writing with alternative proposals which would allow us to achieve the same objectives as the backstop. Until those proposals have been presented, I will not be able to tell you, looking you straight in the eye, that any real progress has been achieved. But what I can tell you is that the talks we had were friendly, constructive, and in part positive.
Well, Dave Keating has more on that vote now from Brussels.
What's important to point out is that this is only a recommendation from the Parliament, because this isn't actually the Parliament's decision to make. It will be a decision for the EU 27, that is the 27 other EU leaders. But we have no indication that they are likely to refuse a request from Boris Johnson to extend the Brexit deadline. France is making noises again that they're not very happy about extending, but we saw the same thing happen last time, and the going wisdom here is that the EU leaders also will probably choose to accept an extension if a request is made, because they don't want to be the ones responsible for no-deal chaos. But the big question is whether Boris Johnson will actually ask for one.
Right, and is this in line with what the governments and the leaders of member states feel about another Brexit extension? 3 years, of course, after the referendum.
Well, of course, we saw immense frustrations in that debate this morning in the Parliament, and a lot of MEPs were pointing to the fact that, the British people like to criticize the EU for not being democratic, and yet the UK Parliament is shut down by a minority government, a minority prime minister. So it was a fiery debate this morning, but definitely reflected also what the EU leaders are feeling. As you say, I mean, the overall feeling here is immense frustration with the UK and the state of the talks, the fact that Boris Johnson is saying that there is progress, and yet, as we heard from Jean-Claude Juncker this morning, there really hasn't been any progress, and there really isn't anything concrete on the table yet. And so I would say the Parliament and the member states are on the same page here: frustration, but not wanting to be the ones to reject a request and throw all of Europe into no-deal Brexit chaos.
Dave Keating there. Well, lawyers for the government have told Britain's Supreme Court that Prime Minister Boris Johnson's move to suspend Parliament just weeks before Britain is due to leave the EU was neither improper nor illegal. Campaigners argue that Boris Johnson broke the law in blocking Parliament from having a say on Brexit. The case is unprecedented in that the executive is pitted against the legislative. The court will rule on Thursday.
The English ones are in myriad documents.
The French President Emmanuel Macron is meeting with the Italian Prime Minister in Rome this Wednesday. It will be the first meeting between the two since Giuseppe Conte formed a new coalition earlier this month that unites the populist Five-Star Movement with the centre-left Democratic Party. The right-wing leader of the League Party, Matteo Salvini, finds himself out of power. Erin Agunke has more.
France and Italy may be historic allies, but their relationship also hit historic lows under Italy's prior government. In February, then Deputy Prime Minister Luigi Di Maio traveled to France to meet with anti-Macron Yellow Vest protesters and offer his support. Paris subsequently recalled its ambassador for several days, a first since 1940. The incident came after a series of similar provocations from Rome. In January, Di Maio said the EU should impose sanctions on Paris, which he accused of pushing migrants into Europe by continuing to, quote, colonize Africa. Shortly after, former Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini poured fuel on the fire by encouraging French voters to boycott President Macron's party in European parliamentary elections.
I hope the French people will be able to free themselves from a very bad president. The French people will choose, I hope, on May 26, somebody more representative, more trustworthy, more consistent, more practical. I'm thinking of Marine Le Pen.
But migration was at the core of fraying Franco-Italian relations over the past year and a half. Last October, tensions spiked when Italy accused French authorities of illegally crossing the border to, quote, dump undocumented migrants into Italy. Matteo Salvini also regularly accused Macron of hypocrisy for criticizing his hardline migration policy, all while also denying entry to migrants stranded in the Mediterranean Sea. But with Salvini gone, it appears compromise on the matter is already in the works. Italy is pushing for an automatic system for distributing rescued migrants among EU countries. It's a proposal France and Germany have reportedly already expressed support for, ahead of an official meeting between EU interior ministers later this month.
That brings us up to date with the international news this hour. You're watching France 24.
Fall in love with thousands of brands with Prime Wardrobe.